Thank you so much to the organizers for, oh, that's okay, for including me and inviting me to be part of these discussions, which have already been incredibly useful in thinking through the things I'm going to talk about. The topic is freedom to create, but I actually want to approach it by going right back to where we started with Tony Bogues talking about contemporary forms of fascism and some older forms of fascism, and work my way from there to freedom. I've been interested over the last few years in the resurgence of a particular narrative about the origins of political liberty. I was paying great attention to Tony's distinction between liberty and freedom, which I found really useful. A number of big history books recently published claim an exclusive origin for modern concepts of political liberty. Guess where? In the European Middle Ages, specifically in some slightly mysterious fusion between the democratic ethos of Germanic warrior bands. This is about brotherhood. That sort of masculine love and the early Christian church, as is quite mysterious. And then the third part of the mix is always some kind of remnant of the bureaucratic structures left over after the collapse of the Western Roman Empire. And somehow from the fusion of all these things, I could name names, but I would like to come back to America, or at least get out. As I say, it's a very old story. Liberty as a political value, it tells us, has its beginnings in European institutions, specifically in archaic systems of male bonding that created voluntaristic forms of political association, in German Gefolgschaft, as well as new sources of military power located outside the realm of kinship and family and domestic relations. In these stories, the domestic realm is always conceived as the root of patrimonial authority and servility, and also femininity. Liberty, in all its modern forms, we're told, everything from independent city-states to parliaments, universities, guilds, stock markets, limited companies, all of this supposedly began in this magical moment when Western societies threw off the shackles of patrimonial authority and tribal loyalties, clan customs, and forged a new path into the future. Much of this reconstruction might simply be dismissed as a fantasy, myth, based on an absurdly selective reading of human history, shreds of Tacitus mixed with Orientalist and homoerotic fantasies of fin de siècle theorists like Otto Höfler, Karl Moily, and Hans Blücher. Whenever I say Blücher, I think of that Young Frankenstein movie. Everyone has to go Blücher. These were ideas that were formulated explicitly in opposition to women's suffrage, and also what they perceived as the pollution of the unique social fabric of European nations by immigration. So, why do these ideas keep coming back? Partly, I suspect, it has to do with the very nature of the stories being told. However much you dress them up in new clothes, econometric clothes, cultural, evolutionary clothes, genomic clothes, they remain stories of heroism, stories about civilizational rebirth and the triumph of masculine liberties over the suffocating hold of custom and a decadent patrimonial state. Stories of this kind are designed to prey on human memory. They push buttons, like Tony Berg put it. How do they work as political practice? I went back to Elias Canetti. There's a passage in Crowds and Power where he's reflecting on this strange alchemy that takes place, which causes a disorganized mass of human flesh to become something like an obedient herd, whether it's a victorious mob or lambs to the slaughter or both. And to achieve this, Canetti suggests, what you really need is discipline at the center. A group, usually small in scale, whose individual members are poised to act and absolutely committed to their task. To an outsider, they will look as unified in their action as members of a wolf pack, he says. Canetti called these groups crowd crystals, and he speculated about their origins in things like seasonal hunting parties and male initiation sets, or groups of soldiers who form around the tomb of a war leader, fallen war leader. The clarity, isolation, and constancy of the crystal, he wrote, forms an uncanny contrast with the excited flux of the surrounding crowd. So I started wondering, is this a purely modern phenomenon, something of the post-industrial world, the world of mass societies, now also translated into digital form? Or is it the eruption of something primordial into the heart of modern civilization? And despite his frequent references to what he calls tribal societies in Australia and Amazonia, it seems hard to avoid the conclusion that what Canetti was really thinking of here were the youth brigades, who formed the vanguard of fascist parties in Vienna, where he lived until 1938. He noted the strange persistence of these social units in history. Once they're in place, they never quite seem to go away. Even when the political projects fail, the costumed band of warriors shrinks back into the shadows of society or moves sideways into spaces of play and make-believe, as we were discussing on the first day, all along with its familiar symbols, waiting for the comeback. But maybe this is also nothing more than an illusion of eternity. Actually, the scholars of the early 20th century, whose names I won't repeat, spent a lot of time pursuing the institution of the so-called Männerbund, Brotherhood Male Association, back into periods of antiquity, ancient history, even prehistory, where it really has no place. And one of the really striking things about that literature is this morbid obsession with exclusively male forms of companionship, love, violence, and death as the basis for forms of political association, or even paradoxically, as core symbols of political liberty. Today we see revivals of the same political mythology in Russia, in Turkey, here in America, also in lots of other places. The historical persistence of symbols like the wolf pack is often taken to indicate something slightly mysterious. And it seems to be almost an unavoidable human trait that we associate mystery with power, when actually we could just be dealing with a stunning lack of originality and political creativity on the part of fascists. Maybe the larger question here should run something like this. Are political movements grounded in concepts of liberty somehow always doomed to end up this way, with warped fantasies of domination? Or to put it another way, could we ever imagine a concept of political freedom that is not heroic, or that is even anti-heroic? And I want to acknowledge here the contributions of not just Tony Berg's, but also Diva Woodley and Laurie Balfour's work on the writing of Toni Morrison, from which I'm currently learning a great deal. My own attempts to grapple with these problems come out of my collaborative work with the late anthropologist David Graeber. In the book we wrote together, we defined three basic forms of human freedom: freedom to move away, the freedom to disobey, and the freedom to create new forms of social reality. We found examples of these freedoms at play in various configurations at many points in human history that lie before or beyond the reach of modern states, and also on all of the world's continents. Today, it must be granted, such spaces of freedom are few and far between. Standard narratives of human history tell us that this loss of basic freedoms is a result of structural transformations that took place in the early stages of human history, beginning with the origins of agriculture, metallurgy, the invention of the plow, followed by the advent of urban life and the rise of archaic states like Pharaonic Egypt or Shang China, early dynastic Mesopotamia, and so on. Based on our assessment of modern evidence from our fields, archaeology and anthropology, we came to the conclusion that this story is wrong in almost every single one of its details. Actually, the disappearance of these freedoms from most of our lives has been a far more recent and uneven process. In many parts of the world, it can only be understood in the context of the last few centuries of land enclosure, mass enslavement, genocide, and spiraling wars of destruction, accompanied by new regimes of private property, credit, and debt, along with systems of territorial sovereignty and surveillance that would have been beyond the wildest dreams of any Bronze Age king or Iron Age emperor. Still, the erosion of these freedoms has been sufficient to make it difficult now for most of us to imagine what it might be like living in a world based on such principles. Of course, the last 500 years has also witnessed the global rise of capitalism, the Industrial Revolution, and the growth of representative democracy in various parts of the world. We might be tempted to see a paradox here. How can the rise of democracy be coeval with an unprecedented loss of human freedoms? It's only a paradox, though, if we choose to forget the human cost of modern capitalism and industrialization, the many local and indigenous forms of direct democracy that were eradicated to make way for representative ones in the service of expanding nation states and business corporations, and how the self-identification of Western powers as free, democratic, went together with their largely unqualified, economically motivated support of regimes that were actively suppressing democratic reform among much larger populations overseas. In ways we perhaps don't fully comprehend, all this has also meant a loss of freedom inside our own democracies, reducing freedom to largely transactional values, freedom to expand your purchasing power, defend your property, or sell your labor to the highest bidder. For all these reasons, I want to stress that the three freedoms we define are not simply individual freedoms. Freedoms conceived in purely individualistic terms can quickly morph into microforms of domination. In fact, they already assume the existence of an infrastructure of punishment and coercion to enforce them. And again, I want to reference Professor Woodley's paper here. Nor are we talking about freedom as an abstract or as a legal concept. We're talking about concrete social freedoms, which also enable the freedom of others, which is to say they presuppose the existence of a different kind of material infrastructure to that of the colonial state, and a different sort of morality to the morality of capitalism, with its familiar atomizing effects. The first freedom, to move away from one's given surroundings, can only become a lived reality if there exist robust networks of hospitality and asylum through which individuals can move, finding shelter and protection along the way. One of the clearest illustrations of this that David and I came across is a concept and practice called Wunan, which was developed by Indigenous thinkers in northwestern Australia. And I should add, we didn't find a place for it in the book, The Dawn of Everything. Actually, we intended to try and learn a lot more about it and include it in some future sequel or something. Anyway, Wunan is a concept of enormous complexity. Anthropologists, European anthropologists, have used the term to refer to two apparently quite different things. Firstly, a system of image making, which comprises these paintings on natural rock surfaces. They're distributed across the ancestral landscapes of the West Kimberley. And secondly, a system of what we might call hospitality zones, traversed by Indigenous people from hundreds of different communities. In anthropological parlance, these form webs of overlapping clans and moieties, which outspan local groups, and they make sure that everyone has a potential host in distant places. And in the course of asserting their native title over the land, Garanyan intellectuals have recently made a point of explaining to Western researchers that actually Wunan means even more than all this. Above all, they emphasize it is a code of law, a code that is impressed on the landscape through the medium of images, and which can only be learned by moving through it. At the same time, it's also a set of prescriptive and proscriptive rules of civilized behavior, the most prized possession of a Garanyan adult, and I'm quoting here a senior lawman called David Maljali, who argued explicitly that Aboriginal civilization is built on this particular combination of aesthetic, topographic, and moral principles, which he contrasts with the economic principles that govern and encompass Europeans' relationship to the land. Similarly, the second freedom, to disobey arbitrary commands, can only become the basis of a free society when accompanied by values of tolerance, patience, persuasion, and reasoned argumentation, which in practice usually also means a good dose of humor, self-reflection, and creativity, a willingness to put yourself in the shoes of another person or imagine a perspective other than the one you were trained into. We explored the case, the historical case of encounters between European colonizers and the indigenous societies of the Eastern Woodlands in North America, specifically the Great Lakes region. Jesuit missionaries like Gabriel Sagal, whose 1632 work, Le Grand Voyage du Pays des Hurons, influenced John Locke and Voltaire, often marveled at the facility of native people for skilled oratory and debate, while at the same time being openly hostile to the obvious freedom, even playfulness, of their social arrangements. Jesuits were equally scandalized by the freedoms enjoyed by Indigenous women, which were unheard of in Europe at the time. Wendat women controlled agricultural resources. They could divorce their husbands at will. Children were bonded to their parents through ties of intimacy, love, and affection, rather than discipline and punishment that included children taken as war captives and adopted from neighboring groups. Sagal found these arrangements to be, on the whole, decidedly more natural than those of typical French households. He was especially struck by the absence of what he called tumults and quarrels in the typical Wendat longhouse. People generally seemed to get on with each other, which also meant there was less need for police, lawsuits, or judges. In his notes on Sagal, which an Enlightenment historian whose name now escapes me, but he's recently published on this in an article called John Locke and the Wendat, and he's looked at the notes of Locke on Sagal, and in those notes, Locke, who at the time is engaged in writing a utopia of sorts, which he never finished, but he observes there how these kinds of domestic relations extend into the public sphere. So Wendat chiefs governed by consent and persuasion rather than force and compulsion. And overall, crime rates were significantly lower than in French colonial towns, despite the lack of prisons or harsh punitive laws. How could such facilities for reasoned argumentation possibly have come to people with no awareness of the works of Cicero, Varro, Quintilian? In considering the matter, Jesuits nearly always noted the openness with which public affairs were conducted. So you have another father, Father Lejeune, in the 1630s writing, "There are almost none of them incapable of conversing and reasoning very well and in good terms on matters within their knowledge. Their councils, held almost every day in the villages on almost all matters, improve their capacity for talking. I would never have believed," he writes, "that without instruction, nature could have supplied a most ready and vigorous eloquence, which I have admired in many Hurons." More clear-sightedness in public affairs. But it's maybe Father Lejeune, writing in 1642, who most clearly perceives a link, a logical connection between reasoned debate, personal freedoms, and the refusal of arbitrary power. They imagine, he writes of the Montagnais Nascapi, that they ought by right of birth to enjoy the liberty of wild ass colts, rendering no homage to anyone whomsoever, except when they like. They have reproached me 100 times, because we fear our captains, while they laugh at and make sport of theirs. All the authority of their chief is in his tongue's end, for he's powerful insofar as he is eloquent. And even if he kills himself, talking and haranguing, he will not be obeyed unless he pleases the savages. Now, at least some Jesuits do seem to have recognized here an intrinsic relationship between our second freedom to disobey and a taste for reasoned argument, accompanied by open, inclusive, often playful debate. And this fact alone seems to have had major repercussions, because it's exactly this style of debate, rational, empirical, skeptical, convivial in tone, which before long comes to be identified with the European Enlightenment as well, traveling west from the Americas, along with habits such as smoking tobacco from pipes and socializing with caffeinated beverages. And of course, Enlightenment thinkers and democratic revolutionaries also saw it as intrinsically connected to the rejection of arbitrary authority, especially the authority of the church. Historians and ethnographers, from Francis Laflèche to Willard Rawlings, have noted how, in the history of the American Midwest, migration was often conceived as the restructuring of an entire social order. So it's really merging the three freedoms, the three elementary freedoms, into a single project of emancipation, to move away, to disobey, and to build new social worlds, new constitutions. What we would now call social movements or revolutions often took the form of quite literal movements through the land. A question occurs to me. If such freedoms existed until relatively recently among groups forced to survive in the dwindling cracks of the modern world system, how then should we imagine the greater part of human history? One of the main arguments of our book, The Dawn of Everything, is that for some time now, the writing of human history and social science on a large scale, the creation of what we might call grand narratives, has converged around a simple task, which is to stop us from imagining those things at all, or rather confine our imaginations to a series of false binaries. Were we originally this or that? Were we egalitarian? Were we hierarchical? Were we cooperative? Were we competitive? Were we kind? Were we selfish? These things make it impossible to even begin to perceive, let alone understand, the true complexities of human social life outside the canonical history of states and empires. Critiquing old paradigms isn't very hard. Creating new ones is much more difficult. And to legitimize new ideas, I think it's always tempting to fall back on the familiar canon. Thinking of Muhammad's talk a bit here. The familiar canon of political philosophy. Actually, David Graeber referred to this as the great books theory of the history of ideas, the great books approach, because Rather than histories of practice, people doing things, it consists almost entirely of histories of men, reading books by other men, books about freedom, books about democracy. In the meantime, most of these men in practice depended on the availability of slaves or paid servants for their everyday needs. Shortly after Graeber died, I fell prey, temporarily, to one such temptation. It sneaked up on me in the form of, actually, Friedrich Nietzsche. He's been around a lot today. One night, I stumbled on his 3 Metamorphoses. It's a parable which opens the discourses of Zarathustra, when the prophet comes down from the mountain after 10 years of solitude and contemplation. I don't ever remember discussing this with Graeber. I wouldn't be at all surprised if it had a home somewhere in his mind palace. Anyway, Nietzsche's Metamorphoses are changes undergone by the human spirit as it becomes, in turn, a camel, a lion, and a child. The camel is the load-bearing spirit. It takes upon itself the burden of command, and it carries this weight off into the wilderness, where it goes through a second transformation into a lion. Freedom will it capture, writes Nietzsche, and lordship in its own wilderness. Out there in the wilderness, the spirit encounters the great dragon with golden scales, whose name is Thou Shalt. To the dragon, the spirit, still dressed up as a lion, replies defiantly, I will. Yet neither the power of the lion nor the camel can match the ultimate claim of the great dragon, which is that all created values are in my body of gold, and all values have already been created. To create new values, says Nietzsche, this even the lion cannot yet accomplish, except by achieving a third transformation. To create itself freedom for new creating, the lion must turn itself into a child. This is the final metamorphosis, because what can the child do that neither the lion nor the camel can achieve? It can make a new beginning and start again, the game of creating. I got very excited. I was very struck by these images. Maybe I thought they could even serve as a kind of mnemonic for our 3 basic forms of human freedom: to move away, to disobey, to create new forms of social reality. One could even think of it as a kind of conceptual scaffold on which to hang them. But is it really what the 3 Metamorphoses are all about? I have no idea. It's hard to say. Like most of Nietzsche's work, you can read these passages in very different ways. And I think Zarathustra is often considered a particularly opaque text. Actually, some people don't even think it's a text. Actually, couldn't you read the whole thing differently, as a negation of social freedoms, or even a symbolic charter for fascism? After all, each transformation of the human spirit in the direction of greater freedom involves a shrinkage of the units involved. Camels move in flocks or herds, lions in prides, but Nietzsche's spirit can only win by concentrating its will down into a singular Promethean form, the rebellious child who goes up against the dragon of time and wins. Isn't it just another expression of the heroic will to power, which has always haunted European ideas of liberty, inaugurating a cult of hero worship, the birth of a leader with superhuman capacities, rising from the ranks of mortals to kindle a flame in the embers of a dying civilization? I have no doubt that the philosophers in the room will continue debating these things for a long time to come. I myself have arrived at the conclusion that we don't need Nietzsche or a great book's approach to the history of ideas in order to bring the 3 basic forms of freedom to life as integral features of human history and experience. Actually, I think if the concept has any value or utility whatsoever, we ought to be able to find it operating as part of lived social realities, as part of practice, in other traditions, including traditions like the ones I've already mentioned, whether it's 17th century Wendat or contemporary Ngarenyin, whose own philosophers are actually no less brilliant in their own ways than Nietzsche. They just happen to have transmitted their ideas primarily through media other than books. None of this, I should add, implies a retreat into cultural relativism or the mere description of other philosophies and ways of life. Universals of human experience remain to be explored. Nietzsche's image of the third metamorphosis as a child who confronts the dragon of time and begins again the game of creation is obviously a literary metaphor. What if instead we begin with the behavior of actual children? And at this point, and to conclude, I want to turn very briefly to an essay that David Graeber wrote about traditional concepts of monarchy in the highlands of Madagascar, where he did his fieldwork. This is an area where people would frequently compare their kings to little children or babies. Every human being, Graeber suggested, has a primordial experience of autocracy, far earlier than any experience of equal relations could possibly be. It lies in their own behavior. Children are would-be autocrats. They are at first incapable of anything else, since they lack the capacity to even comprehend another's point of view. Maybe, he notes, the similarity of kings and babies is unusually obvious in such historical situations as the one in Madagascar, where alongside monarchy, there also existed an explicit ethos of decision-making, democratic decision-making in local assemblies, and where the only criterion for taking part was that you had to be mature enough to formulate a reasonable argument. Toddlers and kings therefore stood out as being just about the only people in society who couldn't do that. They weren't capable of the mutual understanding and compromise which defines such genuinely democratic deliberation. What wider message might we draw from all this? One, as Graeber points out himself, is that the beginnings of human freedom may lie in a revolt against such primal yearnings for absolute power, a counter-reaction that is familiar at some level to anybody who was once such a toddler, such an overweening child, but then experienced relations of love, care, and friendship that allowed them to transcend those desires and move on to something else. Another lesson, perhaps, is that the real roots of domination in the contemporary world lie less in things like the ancient invention of agriculture or the rise of cities than in ongoing transformations taking place at the most intimate scale of human relationships, the level of gender relations, age groups, and domestic servitude, the kind of relationships that contain at once the greatest intimacy and the deepest forms of structural violence. And it's here we suggest, at that small scale of human relations, that the most painful loss of freedoms has taken place. And here too we predict is where the most difficult work of creating a free society will now have to take place. Thank you.